Hi, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to do a first video in a series. It'll be kind of an ongoing series. I don't know how often I'll do it. But it's basically, I call it, is it as good as the book? In reality, it's more of kind of a compare and contrast of books versus films. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to watch a movie or a TV show or maybe movies and compare them to the fiction that they are based upon. For our first selection, what I'm going to do is A Princess of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs. And I'm going to compare that with the Walt Disney movie, John Carter, and a little bit of A Princess of Mars done by somebody. You'll understand why later. But so what I did first, I think I saw John Carter first back when it came out. It bombed. It didn't do very well, and a lot of people didn't like it. I thought it was okay. But what I've done is I've read A Princess of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs, and I've since gone back and watched John Carter of Mars. So first the book, because that came out first. It was published in 1912 as a series of stories. So it was one of those serials where each chapter was probably like a little short story. It's not really a story because it doesn't usually have a beginning, middle, and end. But each chapter was published in a series of magazines. And in 1917, all those were put together in one novel form. So depending on when you want to think about it, it was either published in 1912 or 1917. I tend to think it was 1912. Partly because it feels like a 1912 sort of book. That's maybe the I want to say it's a criticism, but if you want to read the story, then definitely be ready for some very old language. This is written in 1912. It's written kind of as a Western. It has a very kind of almost stilted style. The vocabulary he uses is very much 1912s. So in some cases he'll say something and you'll have to kind of really think about, okay, what does that mean back then? But the story is basically about Captain John Carter, who was a former Confederate soldier of Virginia, which I thought was interesting because Edgar Rice Burroughs is English, but I think he was sort of fantasizing the American West and Southern gentlemen and that sort of thing. And John Carter, through a series of mishaps or adventures, if you will, goes into a cave in Arizona and then passes out and then wakes up on Mars. And there he meets the green men of Mars, these towering, I think like 10 feet tall creatures. They have like two sets of arms and big tusks. They're very barbaric. They speak a weird language. They ride weird creatures. He meets Deja Thoris, who's one of the red-skinned people of Mars. They're a little more civilized. They live in cities. They kind of have property and that sort of thing. And he just goes through a very series of adventures where he's fighting some people and he's friends with them and then he's fighting some other people, and it's all very cool. It is considered the epitome of what we call sword and planet stories. This was a series of stories. I don't know if he invented this, but he definitely perfected it. But it's this notion of, it's sort of science fiction and sort of fantasy. Today we'd probably just call it, science fantasy, or maybe Sword and Planet is a subset of science fantasy. And I did another video on the difference between science fantasy and science fiction. But to recap, science fantasy is has elements of science fiction. Like in this case, the story takes place on Mars. It takes place on a different planet. But there's very lot of hand-waving going on about the technology. There's advanced technology, but we don't really talk too much about how it works, or if we do, it's in very superficial sort of forms. Like, I don't think in Princess of Mars, it's never explained exactly how John Carter got on Mars. And why did it seem like his body was left behind on Earth, but was still alive, and yet he was also on Mars, and he was fighting, and he was getting hungry, and all this other stuff. So there's a lot of this stuff of like, you're not going to get explanations for a lot of these things. What's also interesting about Sword and Planet is that you might have advanced technologies in certain areas, and then totally archaic technologies in other areas. Like in this case, the Martians, they have airships that apparently can fly like 1,000 miles an hour or something. They have terraforming. They have these big things that will help produce the oxygen so that way everybody can breathe on the planet. What else do they have? Sort of like advanced medicines that again we don't really talk about, but unless you have like a really lethal wound, you're probably gonna survive from almost any injury. And yet they do most of their fighting with swords. And they have airships that can fly at 1,000 miles an hour, but most of the people ride just domesticated wildlife on ground and that sort of thing. So you see that's the sort of thing with science fantasy, and we see this a lot with Sword and Planet as well. Edgar Rice Burroughs does a great job of explaining like the Martian cultures and how they are very resource poor, and because of that sort of influences all the societies. They tend to be very ruthless and brutal and warlike. Of course, it's the god of Mars. And then he also gets in rather complicated, system of honor and that sort of thing. And so, if you're a science fiction fan that you like hearing about other worlds and a lot of world building and different cultures and kind of getting in depth of that, then this is a pretty good book. The downside for science fiction fans is this is written from the perspective of 1912. Edgar Rice Burroughs was writing Mars because at the time some of the most cutting edge research about Mars was something similar, that this was either a dead planet or maybe it has a living planet. Percival Lowell, he did the study of all the different canals that he thought was connecting one part of the world to the next. He thought he was seeing vegetation recede and move and that sort of stuff. And so when Edgar Rice Burroughs was writing this story, that was science fiction for him. That was advanced notion of how life might be on Mars. Now today when we do science fiction about Mars, it's something a little more akin to some of I'm trying to think of one of the good movies out there, but something a little more modern, where people are flying there in a spaceship wearing space suits and there's no atmosphere, and or it's all carbon dioxide and there's a lot of radiation. It's super cold and it's not hot even though it's dry. It looks like a desert. It's actually more like Antarctica levels of cold. So that's how we would do science fiction. But in Edgar Rice Burroughs' version of science fiction, Mars could be lived on, like walking around without a spacesuit and that sort of thing. Also, like a lot of the technology is strange. I thought there was one interesting thing where he talks about the 8th and the 9th ray. And what he's getting at is that looking at the visible spectrum, there are 7 colors, not really, but that's how we usually break it down to the Roy G. Biv: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. And what he said was that we've actually discovered there's an 8th and a 9th ray that live on the extremities of these rays, which is kind of interesting because he's sort of talking about infrared and ultraviolet, because infrared is at the far end of the red spectrum and beyond, and then the ultraviolet is on the far end of the violet spectrum and a little beyond that too. I don't know if Edgar Rice Burroughs knew about those at the time. I'm not sure if they've been invented by then. He may have been lucky and have just, invented something that turned out to be true later. He had this weird thing of like they would capture the rays and then use them. Didn't really explain how. But this is also like he didn't have lasers, for instance. So he was playing with rays, but not like ray guns, which we see a lot of in 1950s science fiction. So, like I said, if you're a hardcore sci-fi fan, you might be frustrated because he's not really getting into that in depth. The technology is there to sort of drive the plot and set the setting and that sort of thing. It's not meant to be really related to. Also, very much in keeping with that time period is a lot of romance. It's also called Princess of Mars is also called Planetary Romance because it features heavily a princess of Mars, Dejah Thoris. And John Carter sees her. He immediately, of course, falls in love with her. She's the most beautiful thing ever. And they have this big romance, and a lot of what he does is driven by him wanting to protect her, to save her, to get back to her, all that sort of stuff. So if you like romance, you might actually really like A Princess of Mars, because I found there's a lot of romance elements to it. Now, if you like pure romance, like Harlequin romance, you probably won't, because there's bits of romance, then bits of fighting, and then bits of romance, and bits of, running around and stuff like that. So there's also a lot of very action in it as well. But this is very much your old school kind of romance, where the man is wooing the woman. There's a courtship. He's fighting for her love. He's proclaiming his love for her. She's kind of, back and forth on it, and then he does something great, and she thinks he's the most wonderful thing ever. And so it very much feels like a story that's 100 years old. I like it. I liked it. I thought it was great. It is a bit, because of the language, it's not necessarily a fun read, certainly not a fast read. I think it works a little better as an audiobook. I was reading it and listening to it at the same time, so it's kind of going back and forth. And the listening part was definitely a lot more enjoyable, whereas the reading part requires a little more focus. So I think that's the big thing. But it's had a huge impact on science fiction ever since it's really come out. A lot of sci-fi sort of portal fantasy stories where people go from point A to point B is inspired by a lot of that. One of my favorite, not really writer but artist, I like his stories, is Richard Corbin, and his stories of Den and Neverwhere. I'll probably talk more about that later. He was inspired by that, and a lot of other people were inspired by it to some degree. So was Star Wars was inspired by these sort of things. So a lot of the 1950s stuff was inspired by that. In fact, I think that was basically what science fiction was for a long time, until you get more to the 1950s of after the atomic age, and then sci-fi became something very different. Still very much influenced by that, but if you look at John Carter of Mars, there's a lot of similarities between him and like Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon, that sort of thing. Interestingly, the explanation for Superman originated with John Carter. I don't know if they actually knew this, but John Carter is super strong on Mars because Mars is smaller, has a lower gravity, and so he has to kind of learn how to walk, but he's also like super strong and super stuff, and he can like leap 50 feet and that sort of thing, 100 feet at a time. And that just amazes everybody else, and so he's basically a superhero on Mars, which is kind of the same explanation, at least in the earlier days, of what was going on with Superman. Was he was born on Krypton, a larger planet, had a heavier gravity, and when he came to Earth, he was just like amazingly strong and stuff. Whereas on Krypton, he would just be like a regular dude. And so that was kind of interesting. Was that I think Superman came out in 1931, and this was written in 1912. So it definitely kind of beat him to the punch. So then we go to the movies, and there's really two movies. One I'll spend very little time talking on, and the other one I'll spend a little more time on. The first one is A Princess of Mars. I put that one first because technically it came out first. You can find it online. I think actually someone uploaded the whole video on YouTube. I may put the link in the description. It stars, I think it's Antonio Sabato Jr. and Tracy Lords. It's one of those stories where some low-level B-grade studio, C-grade studio, heard that Disney was going to put out a John Carter story. So they decided to jump on it first and put out their story first. So that way they could kind of beat them to the punch. That happened a lot earlier. I don't know if it happens as much anymore because we don't really have... Blockbuster isn't a thing anymore. So used to, you go to the Blockbuster and you'd see movies with similar titles, and sometimes people would rent the wrong one, or maybe the movie they wanted was read out and they just pick out the other one or something else like that. And so you would see a lot of like kind of copycats movies or something. And so this is something similar. I think partly because the Edgar Rice Burroughs stuff might be in public domain, so I think that maybe they could just grab it and do it. Or I'm not really sure about the legality. So it wasn't meant to be a really good movie. It was meant to be first, and it was first, so it won. But it has almost nothing to do with the book. I watched little bits of it, and I actually would just start skimming because just kind of skip ahead because it's really not very good. The One of the things I thought was frustrating is Deja Thoris in the two movies. Neither movie has her really with red skin. They get closer in the Disney movie, in the John Carter story, but she really just looks swarthy. She kind of looks like she has like a heavy tan. It's an English actress, so they probably just put a lot of makeup on her. But she also has like black hair, and that was the things that the Edgar Rice Burroughs described her as. She had like red skin, like the color red skin, not like Native American or swarthy or something else, but I mean like red skin, and then this coal black hair. Well, in The Princess of Mars, they have Tracy Lords. Not only does she not have red skin, she's not even close to red skin, and she's still blonde. It's like, I know there's brunettes. You could have gotten a brunette to play that part. I understand if maybe Tracy Lord doesn't want to dye her hair or something. But anyway, yeah, Princess of Mars has very little to do with the book. The special effects suck. The acting's not great. So it's I didn't even feel like it was so bad it's good kind of thing. You know, like those kind of movies, kind of like The Room and some other movies you can watch, and they're just so bad you kind of laugh at them. It's a good thing. So I wouldn't really waste your time with that one. John Carter, the 2012 Walt Disney movie, it's a little different. It was a box office flop, but I don't think it was really the fault of the movie necessarily. The filmmaker drove up the cost because he filmed everything almost twice, and I forget what his name was, and so it was super expensive. It was also kind of long, pointlessly long. If they did the story as it was written, it would be a very long movie. It would make a good TV show. It'd be kind of a slog of a movie to get through. In fact, you might have to make two movies out of it because there's just so much there and so much going on and that sort of thing. But what he did was different. He didn't really make the book into the movie. He took elements of the book, stuck it in the movie. I mean, like the premise is the same. John Carter's, a former Confederate soldier, and he's teleported to Mars, and he has to learn how to walk again and survive, and he's a superhero. And there are green men of Mars, and he sees Deja Thoris and falls in love with her, but she's really nothing like they presented in the books. And I think what they're trying to do is combine elements from different books into this one. It was clearly supposed to be a franchise, but once the movie flopped, that was pretty much it. I think even the rights went back to the Edgar Rice Burroughs Foundation. Even they said the movie, they didn't do the story justice, and so it's not, as far as if you've read A Princess of Mars and you want to see the Princess of Mars in film version, you're SOL. There's just nothing out there like that. As far as I'm aware of, no one has actually taken the story and made it in there. If you want to see something like A Princess of Mars, if you want to see maybe a fun science fiction movie, then John Carter Mars is not bad. It's not great. It's not bad. Like I said, it kind of drags in certain places. It's done by Disney. It has some elements of Disney to it. To be honest, the book is not Disney at all. In fact, if they made the book into if they did a faithful translation of the book into film format, it would probably be R-rated, at least a heavy PG. For one thing, everybody's naked. The Martians do not wear clothes, and they kind of disdain or make fun of humans who do wear clothes. He's a little vague on exactly how naked is naked, but it does imply that Deja Thoris is basically just walking around wearing jewelry and not much else. And John Carter is kind of the same thing. I don't know if he's walking around with his dork hanging out or what. At least they can kind of get by with that. They give him like a little loincloth, little shorts or something, and then he kind of wears an open shirt, shows off his muscular chest. Dynamite Comics, for a while, were making comic versions of the Barsoom series, and I really liked how they depicted Deja Thor's red skin, black hair, very curvy. Just happened to have like a few gold coins covering her nipples, and so she's kind of naked, but not exactly naked, you know. So, and then there's just a lot of violence, and things are killing each other, hacking each other up, threatening rape and torture in some places, and so it's not a kid's book, really. But Disney wanted to make the movie, so it's kind of a kiddie sort of movie. I think John Carter only kills one green man, and they just don't really talk about that much. But that was a big deal in the book, was that he was so strong he could kill a green Martian with just one blow. And the green Martians were kind of like, you know, to use another franchise, they're sort of like the Klingons of this world. So imagine if you were a Klingon and a human could just, you know, punch someone one hit and they're dead. The Klingons would respect that. And so that's kind of an element to it of it as well. But so like I said, John Carter, the book is not, I mean, the movie is not bad. It's just, if you want to see a faithful representation, this is not really it. Otherwise, it's kind of a fun movie, and it is sort of a shame that it didn't do well. Here's a fun fact that I put together. Originally, the movie was going to get made in 2006, and originally it was going to be Jon Favreau who was going to do who's going to direct the movie. And I forget exactly why it didn't get made then, but instead it got made in 2012 by another filmmaker. But because Jon Favreau wasn't doing John Carter, he did Iron Man. And because he did Iron Man, and because Robert Downey Jr. was portraying Tony Stark, I think that's the reason why we have a Marvel Cinematic Universe at all. That movie was just so good with those two creators in it that that just propelled pretty much the whole universe. And if you watch the early movies, the early movies were basically just driven by Iron Man. You know, there was also, like, the Incredible Hulk came out, but it wasn't that good. Nobody really paid attention to it. Because let's face it, if Jon Favreau did John Carter, he would do it right. It'd be on time. It'd be on budget. It'd be fun. It'd be exciting. And today we'd be talking about, you know, the latest, you know, John Carter movie coming out instead of what's going on with the MCU. So I thought that was kind of a interesting little tidbit on how sometimes things don't go the way you plan, but they work out pretty well anyway, especially if you're Jon Favreau. And now he's off doing The Mandalorian and might be, you know, taking over Lucasfilms or whatever, all that sort of stuff. So his career has just gone off in a totally different tangent, partly because the John Carter movie flopped. I'd still like to see it. I think it would make a great, like, Amazon Prime show, TV series, that you just tell the story of the books. I think there's like 7 books. There's a lot there. There's a lot of characters there. It'd be very exciting. There's a lot of background to get into. Like I said, if you do it right, it would be at least a hard PG-13 kind of story. So, you know, it'd be kind of good to do this on like a streaming service or something. But anyway, have you seen these? Have you read the books? Have you seen the movies? What do you think? If you would, just leave your comments down below. If you have ideas of other sort of stories you'd like to see in this genre, then let me know, or this kind of format, let me know. I have ideas for others. I have some lined up. It's just usually the hard part is just reading the stories and you know, because a lot of times I'm very familiar with the movies. I could talk about those, no problem. But I want to read the books as well and then revisit the stories. So hopefully I'll have another one out, you know, pretty soon. But anyway, I will talk to you later. Bye.